Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofoutlander.com. For all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Starz TV series and everything in between. This is episode 60, Voyager Read Along, week 18. Hello, and it's good to be back again. I hope you all had a fantastic week, and thank you so much for listening. So, what news was there this week? Well, Sam Heughan was in North Carolina with his friend, and he was enjoying all the sights. He was not out scouting for Outlander locations. He also did a short Twitter chat while he was waiting for his plane yesterday, and though there wasn't anything new from him, there should be a My Peak Challenge announcement coming soon. I also wanted to point you to Matt Roberts. He continues to post the most beautiful photographs of Scotland, and you can normally find them on his No Fooling Productions Instagram account. So now that we have so many holidays coming up right now, we have Hanukkah, Christmas, Yule, Kwanzaa, or maybe you have a birthday this month. I'm curious, what Outlander or Scottish-related items are you asking for or giving? I received a lovely note from a listener. She said, "I enjoy your podcast so much. You have such a nice, soothing voice and approach the subject matter in a very kind and non-judgmental manner. I've listened to you from the beginning, and you get better and better as it goes along." Smiley face. Also, having a medical background, I like the science part as well. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Jay. The feedback is always appreciated. If you have a criticism, I want to hear about it because I want to improve and make this a podcast that will reach many people. And if you have positive feedback, bring it on. Words of encouragement are continually helpful. The weekly Twitter chat brought up some really interesting thoughts on, one, why Leary pulled away from Jamie physically when they were married, and what character or characters the Outlander series ultimately centers around. And that means in the context of all the books, not simply book one. I'm going to be posting a survey on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so please look for it, and when it's there, go and answer on only one of the social media sites. I am intensely curious now. If you come onto the Twitter chat and it's an opinion that either I haven't heard or I don't see in the context of the storylines, then it's not about being argumentative. I want to really understand where you're coming from. One of my friends says that 3-year-olds are anarchistic scientists, and I don't think I've ever outgrown that. And I want to know, and I will ask multiple questions to really ferret out the whole picture so I can see it. So if you have a differing opinion from me and I really want to get into the topic with you, it's because I want to learn more and I want to see it how you see it. Because sometimes my opinion has changed. But what has really altered my Outlander experience over 2.5 decades is the fact that I have changed and had much more life experience. I started out as a married woman with no children in my mid-20s, to getting divorced, getting remarried, and having 4 children, and I'm still married to that same man today. I also became a stay-at-home mother for quite a few years. And then I went back to work and completely changed my field of work. So my experience have been part of what has me see Outlander differently every time I go back through and read it. And I'm sure it affects you. And I think it also affects Diana Gabaldon. These characters have been part of her for decades, probably 3 decades, longer than the rest of us because they were with her before the books were published. And I don't think any of us can be untouched by time and the lens that we view things through. And on that note, I think it's interesting and fascinating to hear what Diana has to say about the characters and where they're coming from and what they mean and what the nuances are. But for me, what it comes down to with any material, once it's out into the public place, once a reader gets a hold of it and is able to ingest it, all of that material becomes highly personal to the reader. The characters become ours. They no longer simply belong to the author. Now, the future of the characters absolutely does. But the characters who are already in the public forum, they're for each of us to take and look at and like or dislike, think are meaningful or not, and that may change over time. So that's something that I like about the Wednesday night Twitter chat, is we get into those things. And I don't think there's any one right answer. I don't think, except for facts in the book. When was somebody born? When did they do X, Y, or Z action? When did something take place? Those are hard and are not fungible. But when it comes to all the inner meanings and the emotional meaning of things, they can be different for each one of us. And simply because I now have compassion for Leary in some areas, because I'm a mother and I'm middle-aged and I've had many differing life experiences and I've matured, I can see her as a woman. It doesn't mean that I want to be her friend. It doesn't mean that I would trust her if I knew her. But I do have some more understanding of her. And I will give her proper allowance and say she was wronged here, or she was right here, or she did something terrible here. But I have incredibly changed my opinion about her over the decades. So, all that said, my diatribe, please look for the survey on the social media sites in the next few days. I'm going to leave it open for probably a month because I want to get as many pieces of feedback as possible. And finally, I would like to say thank you for joining me at my virtual dining room table for conversation and a dram of Outlander. So this is chapter 48, where we embark from, and it's called Moment of Grace. Sometimes the descriptions of the chapters don't hit us in the face as we go through it, and we have to figure out what it means. In this chapter, it becomes really obvious quickly. We see that Claire is stuck on the Porpoise, and all she can do is find a routine. The description of the harrowing task in front of her of combating these germs is absolutely brutal. The hours after a battle are urgent and chaotic, with men's lives hanging on a second's action. Here a doctor can be heroic, knowing for certain that the wound just stanched has saved a life, that the quick intervention will save a limb. But in an epidemic, there is none of that. Then come the long days of constant watching and battles fought on the field of germs, and with no weapon suited to that field, it can be no more than a battle of delay, doing the small things that may not help, but must be done over and over and over again. Fighting the invisible enemy of disease in the tenuous hope that the body can be supported long enough to outlast its attacker. To fight disease without medicine is to push against a shadow, a darkness that spreads as inexorably as night. I had been fighting for 9 days, and 46 more men were dead. She continues and says, Still I rose each day at dawn, splashed water into my grainy eyes, and went once more to the field of war, unarmed with anything save persistence and a barrel of alcohol. Think about that. All she can do is stem the tide. She knows men will become ill that are already incubating. They're brewing this disease. And she's hoping to stop any new infections and to find the person who's responsible for it. And this is an illness that can be asymptomatic. And Karen Doherty talked about that in that Outlander Science Club. And she explained it and talked about Typhoid Mary. It's amazing. And when it comes to all living things on planet Earth, in the ocean, on the land, in the sky. Anything that's alive has a purpose, and the purpose is to propagate and stay alive. And that includes germs. Whether they're viruses, whether we have bacteria, whether it's the beautiful flowers or the weeds, everything has that internal sense to survive. And that description to me, I can't imagine how weary she is, what she looks like, what her physical countenance is. She's already thin from the rigors of travel. She must look like skin and bones. How is she staying hydrated? What is she doing to take care of herself? Nothing. She's barely sleeping and eating. Next, we find that she has indeed located the source of infection. His name is Howard, and he was first on the gun crew, but an injury sent him to work in the galley. She figured this out by gathering information from the dead ship's surgeon's meager notes, and his name was Mr. Hunter. Put a little pin in that. The first ill man had eaten, which in the book is called mast, it's a ship's term, with the gun crew, and then 4 more men from the gun crew became ill. Men who were still ambulatory, able to walk, took the illness into the ship's head, allowing it to spread widely aboard and across the ship. Howard was still working in the galley. He admitted to having seen sickness like this prior on other ships where he had served. He is the source. So it sounds like he had an asymptomatic case of it. Somebody like this should never work in food handling, ever. Because remember, it's spread by contaminated urine or feces. So if he goes to pee, he's not washing his hands, and he goes back into the kitchen. That's all it takes. Howard was taken to the brig after a fight with the ship's cook about losing a good hand based on a goddamned female's silly notions. Howard had no idea what crime he had committed. So for the rest of his life, he could never work in food preparation again without getting people sick. That's a pretty daunting knowledge, right? So this here we have a small victory for Claire, putting that puzzle piece into place. So she remember that bucket list she was making in her head? Well, she can check that one off. And I was thinking about Howard. If he believed Claire, if he could make any connection and understanding to what was in his body, can you even sit with the guilt and horror of finding out that you carry something without symptoms that has killed dozens of men on this ship alone? That doesn't take into account the other ships that he'd been serving on. He likely did not believe it, of course. Germ theory was not a thing yet. But if he had any inkling that Claire was correct, I could see it completely emotionally crippling someone. And it does make sense that they quarantined him in the brig. No one's going down there to see him. So what that means is he's no longer creating new contamination by himself. And if they can keep the other men away from each other and keep the heads clean and make people rinse with alcohol when they're going in and out of the different areas, she could get it to stop and lessen the amount of dead on ship. And we come to Claire finding that moment of peace the chapter is named for. As she comes up from the galley, the sunset lay in front of her. It's magnificent and awe-inspiring. So much so that she must stop and take it in. It's golden as the streets of heaven are described. I looked up symbology for sunsets. Sunsets can denote a completed work, a passage of time, show the beauty of the mystery of life itself. I'm not sure what it means in this circumstance. If you have any brilliant ideas, please contact me and let me know. What I do know is that it allows her to take a break and for it to speak to her spirit. She allows it to nourish her. The light spread from the sky to the ship, and the great horizon was no longer a blank threat of emptiness, but the habitation of joy. That's what Claire thought. Have you ever experienced that in a sunrise or sunset? There is almost nothing else like it on earth. She is left without bitterness. She is warmed and cleansed. She could no longer smell or see the sickness. She was living in the center of the sun. What a piece of peaceful writing. This burst Claire's heart, and it gave her an external point of centering. Grace had found her here too. Claire is not openly religious, though she says she's Catholic, but she has the Spirit upon her. She acknowledges it. As the moment passed, she crossed herself and went below. Her tarnished armor was faintly gleaming. She takes it as a sign to keep on, of encouragement, that she is indeed not alone in this harrowing, lonely task. It's such a spot of precious calm for her. Even if it lasted 1 minute, she got that pause where the universe slowed and she just took it in. And she was able to pour her burden out. And we learn next, sadly, that young Elias Pound, who had been her helper, died 4 days later of typhoid. It was a quick infection. From early symptoms to death was short. And he died in Claire's arms. She stood by the captain after her day's work as he read the burial service, and the midshipman Pound was commended to the sea, wrapped in his hammock. I always thought a burial at sea just like that would be the best way to be buried, since that's not really an option anymore in the U.S. that I know of. And I can't have a Viking funeral, which would be especially badass. I'll take a routine burning. Not at the stake like a witch. Claire needed solitude after Elias Pound was commended to the sea. She found the quietest corner of the afterdeck and waited for darkness. She found no peace in the beautiful sunset or starry sky due to the terrible knots in her heart. She was physically in pain, sore, swollen, stiff, head aching. She had lost 23 men between dawn and dusk. Elias was only the first one. She says death is the enemy to a doctor. Here are her words. Any doctor hates to lose a patient. Death is the enemy, and to lose someone in your care to the clutch of the dark angel is to be vanquished yourself, to feel the rage of betrayal and impotence beyond the common human grief of loss and the horror of death's finality. I had lost 23 men between dawn and sunset this day. Elias was only the first. Several had died as I sponged their bodies or held their hands. Others, alone in their hammocks, had died uncomforted, even by a touch, because I could not reach them in time. I thought I had resigned myself to the realities of this time, but knowing, even as I held the twitching body of an 18-year-old seaman as his bowels dissolved in blood and water, that penicillin would have saved most of them, and I had none, was galling as an ulcer eating at my soul. To Claire's core, she lives her physician's oath. It is within her DNA. She is. It is not what she does. I think sometimes it looks like Claire has a coolness about her, that she might not be approachable, that she's stern, and that she steamrolls sometimes. But I think she's like that because she cares deeply, possibly more than other people. And it's not the normal grief of losing a loved one. It is so much more than that. It is the knowing that you're not enough and you can never be enough. And as many as you can capture and keep them earthside, there are those who will slip through your fingers. It's a devastation that healers have to live with. The fact that penicillin could have saved many of them really bothered her. Her foreknowledge is not a comfort, but a burden in times like this. There is no way she could know about the antibiotic resistance to come quickly upon us because of how clever bacteria is. She couldn't take comfort in knowing that. The amount of penicillin she would have had is incredible for a ship size of 600 crew. And if she had the kind of penicillin that she would have carried, I don't know how she could have ever had that much. Regardless of the facts, her small penicillin stash was on the Artemis and would only have helped 1 or 2 men, and dozens have died. And she says, but even knowing that, I raged at the futility of it all, clenching my teeth until my jaw ached as I went for, man to man, armed with nothing but boiled milk and biscuit and my 2 empty hands. She hates that she cannot outwit this disease, and Claire is recalling the faces, and she strikes the rail. Again and again, in rage, in grief, impotence, loss. She was stopped by a voice behind her. Then he grabbed her wrist. She struggled to get free. Again he tells her she must stop or she'll hurt herself. I don't bloody care. But defeated, she slacks her arm, and he lets go. She turns to see an unfamiliar face, definitely not a sailor. His clothing, now worn, had been fine when new. He's of slender build. Then in pure Claire fashion, who the hell are you? She tries to gather herself and wipe her cheeks. He hands her a crumpled but clean handkerchief. I love that she goes from her complete out-of-the-box emotional storm to the safety of her clinical, detailed self, where she starts looking at all of what's around her. And she measures it, and she lists it off. I would like to know exactly why she does that and where that skill came from, because I don't think it was from her going to medical school, because she did it before. She probably did it when she was a child. Maybe it was after losing her parents and the world no longer seemed like a safe place. And she had to stop and take everything in to ground herself, to create safety, and to figure out where she stood. What were the odds? My name is Gray. I expect that you must be the famous Mrs. Malcolm, whose heroism Captain Leonard has been so strongly praising. She grimaces. He apologizes for saying something wrong. She says it's not heroic to watch men die. Thanks him for the hanky. He offers her a drink, and she takes it. It warmed and fortified her. She thanks him and says she forgot how good brandy is to drink, having been using it to wash people in the sick bay. This is too much for her, she says it, and she sags back onto the powder box. She is spent, and she is as raw as she can be. For somebody she doesn't know to see her in this state, and she can't whip herself out of it, it's a vulnerable position to be in. They discuss this plague. Less are getting sick, which is great, but she can't do much for those who are already infected. At this, he picks up one of her hands, runs his thumb over a blister and her cracked and reddened knuckles. You appear to have been very active, madame, for someone who is doing nothing. Claire snaps at him and pulls her hand back. It doesn't help, she insists, and goes in a diatribe about the amount of men she has lost, how long she's been on her feet. She's been elbow deep in filth and vomit. Her clothes are sticking to her. None of it has been good. She says she couldn't help. She's losing her professional crap right in front of a stranger. But for some reason, it's okay. At this, he turns away to apologize for having stayed in his quarters at the captain's orders. He had no idea how bad it truly was. He would have helped if he knew. And her response, I can't see any other character saying this. Maybe Jamie. Maybe Jenny. Why? It isn't your job. Is it yours? And he looks at her in surprise. And she sees him as a handsome man in his late 30s, with large blue eyes and fine features. Yes. After studying her and becoming thoughtful, he says, I see. She says he doesn't, but that it doesn't matter. He should stay in his cabin on the captain's orders. There are enough sick-bay hands, but nothing helps. He stands at the rail, looking out to the sea. He does understand. He heard her beyond a woman's natural compassion. I have been a soldier, an officer. I know what it is to hold men's lives in your hand and to lose them. At this they stood in silence. So they're peers, they're leaders, they're equals here. And he leaves her with this wisdom. What it comes to, I think, is the knowledge that you are not God, and the very real regret you cannot be. That's some sage advice from John Gray. This lifted the burden from Claire. She relaxed at being understood. Yes, is all she says back. He bends and kisses her hand. He bids her good night. To have somebody see you at a point of vulnerability and rage and anger and defeat, and to have them understand, is amazing. Claire would have had Jamie normally for that. He would have seen it. He could have comforted her through this. And John Gray was able to do that for her. As he's leaving, he is spotted by one of the seamen and admonished for being out of his cabin. He agrees, of course, to the reproof, and he disappears into the shadows. As he passes, Claire grabs the steward and asks him who the man was that he was talking to. Why, that's Lord John Gray, the new governor of Jamaica. Shazam! So she met the special person on the ship. He bids her good night as well. Claire has one more set of rounds to do. She stands again at the rail, inhaling the clean, fresh air, bright stars above, and she realizes the moment of grace indeed had come again. She speaks to the sea and sky. You're right. A sunset wouldn't have been enough. Thank you. And she went below. So Lord John Gray was her angel, was her peace. It came in an exceedingly unexpected form. She got her tank refilled by Lord John Gray. I mean, holy wow. What a wonderful way to bring him back into the storyline. One thing that dawns on me is they are amenable toward each other at this meeting. He is humble. He didn't fear her outburst. She sees him as a fine-looking man. This gets me thinking that the captain has not told Lord John that Jamie Fraser is on the Artemis and that this is his wife. Otherwise, John may have lost his mind, surely, and he would have been jealous, and he would not have had the same behavior toward Claire. This Typhoid story is wrapping up. We've met the new governor, and he's an old favorite. And they are about a week or so away from landing in Jamaica. So we're seeing things starting to come full circle. Storylines that have been hanging out there in the breeze and limbo are coming back. Chapter 49, Land Ho. It's true what sailors say. You can smell land a long time before you see it. Claire says the goat pen in the hold of the ship is a surprisingly pleasant place. She is reconnecting to nature. She is taking in something of land after a long voyage at sea. The sight, the scent of animals, and even the hay were better than the unwashed sailors. She sees how Annekje Johansen keeps the pen swept and tidy. For Claire, things of the natural world matter. They are part of her existence. She needs those green things and dirt. Having this touchstone is important for her well-being. She remarks on how Annekje croons to a yearling she needs to entice closer. Turns out it has a tick. Annekje deftly removes the tick from the goat's ear, much to its annoyance. And then Claire wipes the small wound with alcohol, so he won't have a sore ear later. And she describes the velvet ear, the square pupilled bulging eyes, and the bleeding. Once the goat is freed, it runs right back to the others, and Annekje casually squashes the tick. Claire is hatching a plan of her own. She talks to Annekje about being near land. She needs to get there, but it's a secret. She asks if she can help. Annekje thinks for a moment, and Claire thinks she seems similar to her goats, cheerful, adaptable, placid, thriving despite the long voyage. After her pause to think, she says, "Yeah, I help." Claire found out they were anchored off of the Watlings Island. It is now called San Salvador Island. It is an island and district of the Bahamas. It is widely believed that during Christopher Columbus's first expedition to the New World, San Salvador Island was the first land he sighted. It's 63 square miles and a population of 930, and that was as of 2010. So it's a itty-bitty place. She describes the feeling of landfall after being at sea, what sea legs are, and what happens when one is landbound again. Long enough on a rolling ship, and you forget what it is to walk on land. Getting sea legs, they call it. It's a metamorphosis, this leg getting, like the change from tadpole to frog, a painless shift from one element to another. But the smell and sight of land makes you remember that you were born to the earth, and your feet ache suddenly for the touch of the solid ground. Her connection is returned. She yearns, and she needs it. The ship was anchored for only a brief time to replenish water supplies before heading through the Windward Isles and onto Jamaica. The amount of sick men had nearly dried out all the liquid casks. One more week to Jamaica. She had been gathering intelligence about the small island. She had no intention of taking the Royal Navy up on its hospitality on Jamaica to be used as bait to get Jamie arrested. Only the watering party was allowed ashore, and a Marine was stationed at the gangway to block any attempts at disembarking. Many crewmen were at the railing gazing upon the land. Even Lord John Grey stood with his face upward to the sun. Think about that. He's pale anyway because he's English, but being sequestered to a cabin for 2 months during a typhoid outbreak, he has to be more pale than can be described and in desperate need of vitamin D. Small doses, John. 5-10 minutes at a time. No sunburns. Claire would have gone to speak with him, but the plan for her escape was already in motion. She was calculating the distance and her odds at getting away. She believed the captain wouldn't waste time in following her because of his need to get to Jamaica quickly. And what could he do to her if she was caught? She wasn't truly a captive, nor was she a seaman. Annekje reappears on deck with a young goat. She says her goat needs fresh grass and she must go ashore, and the Marine says no. She does a fine job at arguing with him in order to draw him away so Claire can slip behind him and down the gangway. It's a good plan. She would even drop the goat so it would have to be chased around to cause a distraction if needed. It was almost perfect. And then the captain comes up beside Claire. Of course she wants to knock him overboard, but instead she smiled and she's thinking, bloody hell, GHRC. I'm sure she had some other lovely things going on. He proclaims landfall is as much her victory as his. It is doubtful without her the Porpoise would be brought to land at all. She assures him he would have done quite fine. He explains further about her help and skill as a physician. She notices that he is shaved in honor of the land. At this he tells her he will write a letter to the governor and commissioner telling of all she did, a testimonial of sorts, because it just might help. He felt out of honor. He must tell her that he knows her real name, Mrs. Fraser, And he knows who her husband is. Really? What is he? Seriously, Claire? Come on, tell me something I don't know, guy. Why, Mum, he's a criminal. You mean you didn't know? She says she knows, but what is he getting to? He says because he wrote it in the ship's log, he must report him to the authorities. He regrets the decision now. He'll be taken when the Artemis docks and hanged. He apologizes and says he cannot ask her to forgive him. As he walks away, he sees Annekje and the goat, and she's still arguing with the sentry, and he demands the goat be off the deck. As Annekje takes her own leave to go back to the goat pen, she looks at Claire, and her blue eye says, "We'll try again." She's a good woman, this Annekje. 4 days later, a gust of wind split the main mast. They limped along until they came to a port to get repairs done. Bottled Creek, North Caicos Island. Today it happens to be the largest settlement on North Caicos. Though everyone was allowed ashore, it didn't help Claire's plans. It was a foodless, waterless island. Annekje, though, sees it as an opportunity. She knows the route. They would be traveling a different one because of the damaged mast. They would be heading through Mouchoir Passage at Hispaniola. It's a big island. And Claire's interested in what she has to say, and Annekje begins to draw the way into the sand. Claire's not completely understanding what she means, so she dumps out the pan of whelks. So what is a whelk? I'll tell you quickly. A whelk is a common name that is applied to various kinds of sea snail, many of which have historically been used or are still used by humans and others for food, although a number of whelks are relatively large and are in the family Bucinidae. The word whelk is also applied to some other marine gastropod mollusk species within several families of sea snails that are not very closely related. And Annekje adds water to the pan and swirls it. Then adding a piece of string shows Claire how the water will carry her into the island, like the tides did for Ian and the Murrays and Jamie off of Seal Island. And so Claire knows that that can work. And then she tells Claire she will have to jump. And Claire thinks she's crazy. "Yeah, but it work. Vada move you. You try not to drown, yeah?" "Yeah, I'll try." Humor-infused horror. A man of war is an incredibly tall ship, so Claire having to jump off the side of it into the ocean is a terrifying prospect. So in this Mouchoir Passage, if Claire jumps at the right place, she will be carried to the land on Hispaniola, but she could drown or be hurt by the impact of jumping off the ship. It's a risk. She could lose anything on her person in the swim. Who might she come across? How will Jamie find her? Would you do it? It seems like a sound plan, but it's a tremendously difficult one. The other thing to remember about this risky maneuver is that Claire is not at her optimum energy level. She's exhausted. Her body is already battered from this work she's been doing as a physician. Now we're into chapter 50. I meet a priest. Well, Claire jumped. She's been in the water, though warmer than usual water. It's been 2 or 3 hours. Her hands were chilled and her feet were numb. She had made a life preserver out of 2 casks and a rope. Mrs. Johansen was good as her word. She was getting pulled toward Hispaniola. She thinks she left the ship around midnight, and it was likely around 4 a.m. But you couldn't tell by the skies. Not like some. She thinks she's about a mile from shore still, and it's a slow current, and she's exhausted. So she wraps her wrist in the rope so it won't come loose, and leaned on the cask for a nap. How desperate must she be to be able to sleep? That's how tired she was. That's how physically and emotionally spent she was. She really could sleep anywhere. On-call work and that type of sleep training will do that to you. She awoke to her feet brushing solid ground. She disentangled herself and let go of the casks. Once freed, she takes stock of herself, that personal inventory she and Jamie both use as a grounding practice. Her shoulders had indentations from the ropes. Her wrist was rubbed raw. She was cold, tired, and thirsty, with her legs rubbery as boiled squid. But she had done it. She had escaped. Now she needed to get fully ashore, find fresh water to drink, before getting transport to Jamaica. She needed to find Jamie and the Artemis before the Royal Navy did. For now, item number 1 was about all she could manage. Her location had dark, sticky brown mud and ugly vegetation, a far cry from the white sand beach postcards she had seen. Mangroves were everywhere. They grabbed at her clothing and her hair, and she tripped over the roots as she moved toward shore. She was barefooted, ankle deep in the mud. Her shoes were rolled up in her hiked-up skirt. And she had a fish knife just in case. She's brave. She's alone with these huge tasks in front of her. Rare courage. The rising sun felt warm. It dried her clothes and took the chill away, but within an hour she was sweating and growing thirstier. There was no way for her to see beyond the mangroves, but she knew regular land must be there. Then a sound like a small cannon went off, and she was so stunned she dropped the knife and went digging for it. Then she lunged onto her face when something whizzed by her head. Then she heard quark, and she had to wipe the muddy hair from her face. A large black bird was eyeing her, and the bird preened himself as though to contrast Claire's state of disarray. She snarks at the bird. Then the bird looked at her, breathing in, inflated a large red pouch, and boom came from him. It startled her again. She yelled at the bird not to do that. I know we all would, because we've all yelled at an animal for something or other in our life. More birds came, and it was a booming party. She had places to go, so she left these threatening birds behind. But in a half an hour, she made little progress. She could only think of water, not even Jamie. Exhausted, dehydrated, her lips were cracked. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Suddenly, movement catches her eye. She sees small, unusual fish, unlike any she had ever seen. These fish had 4 eyes, not 2. Either I'm hallucinating or you are, she says. And the fish was staring back at her. She sat and was momentarily cooled by the sun retreating behind a cloud. And as she looked up, she saw a purple mass coming over the hill. The tide was rising. A storm was coming. Rain, oh, delicious rain. But she was unsafe where she was with the rising tide, and she'd panicked for a moment. And she calmed herself down by checking her pulse. It was high, but normal. She was fine. She was not going to have a heart attack. She would go toward the mountains. And at this point, she had lost her shoes. Her hair was wind-whipped. And when the rain came, she rinsed her kerchief out several times, then allowed it to soak up the rain for her to suck on. It tasted of sweat and seaweed and coarse cotton. It was delicious. Best water she ever had. Still in the mangrove, she pressed on. The tide was rising. Lightning was striking in the distance, and the tide was so strong she had to hold on to a mangrove when it went out, and she could only move forward when it came in. She was half drowned by a wave, but when she became upright again, she saw she was facing a tree. 4 more waves, and she finally struggled to that tree. A welcome embrace, she says. She made it. Her body was bruised, battered, filthy, sore, and tired. But she had made it onto the land. She beat the mangroves. She climbed to a 12-foot perch where she could see the mangrove she came through and the open sea. She realized her wisdom in leaving the Porpoise. Out at sea it would be much worse. There was thunder and lightning over her head now. And she'd hoped the Artemis was slow enough to still be out in the open Atlantic Ocean, avoiding the storm. Close to her, the mangrove was struck by lightning. She held onto the tree trunk and prayed for Jamie and the Artemis, for the Porpoise, Annekje Johansen, and Tom Leonard, and the governor, and for me, she said. She must have fallen asleep, for it was full daylight when she woke with her leg wedged in between two branches, and it was numb. When she dropped from her perch, she tried the water, but it was not potable. It was brackish. How could she sleep? Probably as a refuge, out of sheer exhaustion, desperation, escape from what was happening. Probably all of them. Her body gave everything, and it needed to rest. And as she walked, she was limping, getting the pins and needles out, knowing there had to be fresher water nearby. And as she moved, the landscape changed into something more lush. But she couldn't go far without stopping, as thirsty and weak as she was. And every time she rested, she would be greeted by the odd little fish. And she says, "Well, I think you look rather peculiar, too." "Are you English?" said the voice incredulously. She thought she had fallen into Alice in Wonderland's world, and then she looked up to see the man who had actually spoken. He had black curly hair, he was weathered and bronzed from the sun, of above average height and thick in the shoulder with a broad, bold face, and it was wary but friendly. She's doing that clinical Claire thing again. She's taking note of her surroundings, paying attention to every detail. His clothes were shabby, and he had a canteen made of goat skin from his belt. How did she know exactly that it was goat skin? I don't know. Let's just say she knew. Then repeats his question en français. "Vous êtes anglais? Comment ça va?" She says she is English and asks for water. His light eyes popped open and he handed the bag to her. She gulped the water with the knife protectively upon her knee. He cautions her about drinking so quickly. "I know, I'm a doctor." He was looking at her funnily, and she thought, well, she must look kind of odd. She was sea-soaked and sun-dried, mud-caked and sweat-stained, with her hair straggling down her face. She must look like a beggar, and probably a demented one at that. "A doctor? A doctor of what, if I might ask?" "Medicine," she replies. "Indeed," he says. "Wait for it." "Madame Physician, allow me to introduce myself. Lawrence Stern, Doctor of Natural Philosophy of the Gesellschaft von Naturwissenschaft Philosophieren, Munich." Whew, that was a mouthful. Had to let my inner German out. He was making his way toward those birds. Then he heard her talking to a fish. She asks if they really have 4 eyes. He says yes, or it seems so. They seem to use one pair above water to observe, and the other pair to observe below. He asks for the honor of knowing her name. She decides on the truth. Fraser, Claire Fraser, Mrs. James Fraser. Marital status could be important and make her more respectable than her appearance. He asks if she's been shipwrecked. She says she needs to get to Jamaica. He helps her up and says he has a friend nearby to take her to. Now that her thirst was quenched, her stomach started growling when he mentioned food. She says it would be very nice indeed. As they walk together, she recounts what she sees. They go through a palmetto grove into a meadow-like space that rose up to a hill. A house, or something like a ruin, sat at the top. There were pink bougainvillea and a guava that were not well cared for. A holey tin roof. Overall, it seemed quite shabby. He points and says, "Hacienda de la Fuente." Lawrence asks if she's able to walk up the hill. He can carry her if needed. Punctured, bruised, sore feet notwithstanding, she thought she could make it. There were sheep trails up to the house, and peaceful sheep, too, grazing in the sun. One sheep was startled by their appearance and let out a bleat. Then every other sheep stopped and looked up at them. She hiked up her skirts and followed Stern up the main path. And she inhaled the scent of grass and flowers, accompanied by sheep and heated dust. and an insect landed on her for a moment. There was fresh life exploding around her. She is safe. She'll be helped and she'll be fed. The butterflies, maybe it was the butterflies, because her fear and burdens were lifting away. She still had much to do, but she found an unexpected friend. Are you thinking about who Lawrence Stern is? How you know him? We're going to get to it. A small figure was ahead and Lawrence yelled, "There he is!" And Claire remarks, "Jesus, it's St. Francis of Assisi." Irreverent as always, our Claire. Stern says it's Signor Fogden, and he's an Englishman. Stern yells his name up to the man, and the man seems not to know who Stern is. He has a red scraggly beard and long messy hair, and when they approached him, a butterfly launched from his head. "Stern?" the man said with question. And he says, "Oh, it's you. Why didn't you say it was the shitworm man? I should have known you at once." Stern, embarrassed, explains to Claire that he had been collecting parasites from the sheep shit. Some up to a foot long, the man says. Stern assures her no more than 8 inches. And then he asks Father Fogden if the remedy worked. It had very well, but a few sheep had died. Father Fogden invited them to a midday meal. Claire is introduced as Mrs. Fraser, a countrywoman of Fogden's. He is wowed that there is an Englishwoman here. "Your most obedient servant, mum," as he bowed to her. He whistled "Mi casa e su casa," then a King Cavalier spaniel came out of the weeds. He had Claire's arm tucked into one of his, and a sheep's top knot in the other, and the 3 of them to the house they went, with Stern following behind. And again she shares what she sees. It's an unkempt courtyard. There's a cloud of dragonflies in one corner. There's fowl running amok. She thinks the trees are where their normal roost is. Stern finishes explaining to Fogden how he encountered Mrs. Fraser, but stops to admire a large dragonfly, 4 inches across. The ewe, Becky, the top knot he was pulling on, came with them. You see, Father Fogden is a little eccentric. And she notices that the branches above their head had become entwined, making a leafy roof. Inside, the house was immaculately kept, but it was dark compared to the outside, and it took her eyes a bit to become accustomed. It was a plain room with the usual furniture, and of course, there was a Spanish-style painting of Christ. It was very graphic, and it caught her full attention until she realized there was somebody else there. A woman of small height, maybe 4 feet, thick around, with black, angry eyes. She looked to Claire like an ill-wish doll. Her name is simply Mamacita. She greets Stern as Ciclero, Christ killer, and asks who this puta Alba is. She's calling Claire a whore. "Senora Fraser," he replies, and that she needs their help. She glares at Claire, but the food is ready. The table was set for only one, so Father Fogden pulls out 2 more settings. Now, I said he was a little eccentric. Well, it gets even weirder. He has a coconut on the table he calls Coco, and since they have no visitors, he's happy to have the company. The coconut, Stern says, is a hobgoblin. Yeah, it's getting real up in here. Father Fogden tells Claire how pretty she is, though not as much as his, Hermenegilda. He wondered aloud if one of Eve's dresses would fit Claire, doubtful, as Claire at 5'6" was quite tall for that era. Mamacita served plantain fried with manioc and red beans. When the meal was over, sangria was served and the conversation commenced. The sangria was a comforting mix of wine, lemon, and orange juices, mulled with spices. It can be served hot or cold. And Claire couldn't say she had tasted it before because of the era she never would have. But Claire does remember her first taste, and it was in the company of a marijuana-smoking grad student and a professor of botany. And at this, the father gets up and rolls an herbal cigarette of hemp. Hemp is low in THC, though it's kin to cannabis, but it doesn't cause one to get high. It can be smoked, but it's usually used for industrial purposes. Rope, fabric, even is made into a type of vegetarian milk. So I'm not sure if this is the low THC hemp or if it's actual cannabis or what we refer to as marijuana, weed, etc. It seems to affect him, but he's also drinking a lot of sangria, so I'm not sure if he's high or not, along with being drunk. He smoked it and asked what Stern would be up to, that they would be going into a town, then getting a boat. And he says it's dangerous to go over land to the town Le Cap because of all the Maroons. Maroons are bands of escaped slaves. They hide in the jungles of the hills, and there's caves there. He doesn't think they'll be troubled because Claire doesn't look worth robbing. Imagine her sitting, eating a meal, mud-caked, even in her hair. She's got gashes on her. She has no shoes. Her clothes are torn. And she sat at this dinner table, filthy and eating. At this, Claire says she needs some fresh air and asks for some waters to wash with. They go to the patio, and there was a trough with water from a spring. And they chat about the amount of springs in the area, that the locals think that there are spirits in the springs. And at this, Fogden remembers he has something for Stern, and he pulls out a small dried fish. They discussed whether a fish can become a ghost, soul or no. Stern says it's a blind cave fish. He'd only seen one once before, deep inside a cave called Abandawi. Tuck that little note away. And then Stern asks if he can have it, and yes, of course, Fogden gives it to him. And Father Fogden asks where Mamacita is. Here, Cavron, which literally means a male goat, but in common slang usage, it means asshole or bitch. She's so kind. She calls Stern a Christ killer, Claire a whore, and now she's calling Father Fogden an asshole. Mamacita, you're a peach. And Claire notices an odd scent rising to her nostrils. And there's a sheep skull here. And Father says, oh, it's Arabella. Okay. Arabella was a member of his flock, but she's a sheep member, not a human. Don't worry. He says she was murdered by a bunch of sailors. He talks about her lovingly. Sailors? Claire worries it could be the Porpoise, but surely not. And he shows them the lump in the cupboard covered in beetles. It had white maggot larvae of the dermestid beetles. They were hard at work polishing Arabella's skull. Ugh, gag. Even Claire was a bit off-put by this. It made her dinner kind of rise. And Fogden swayed but caught himself, suddenly remembering that Claire needs clothes. He asks Mamacita if they have something for Claire. He starts to ask about E's clothing, and she says back, they are much too small for such a cow, she says in Spanish. Give her your old robe if you must. And she scornfully looks at Claire and says, come. I think Mamacita needs a little bit of Jesus, because she's pretty hateful. Maybe she needs some of that ganja and sangria to chill herself out too. She takes Claire to a smaller patio, gives her water and soap, and she leaves a gray robe that has a belt. And she says in Spanish, wash away the blood on your hands, Christ-killing whore. Claire will be a whore until the day she dies, from the very first of the Outlander books to the end. I love a running joke. Claire fixed herself up the best she could with the supplies at hand. She had no comb, and she fingers through her hair, but she's feeling clean and much fresher, and it's so much better than what she was. She starts thinking about the priest, wondering if he had some sort of dementia or effects of alcoholism and cannabis intoxication. Regardless, he was a kind, gentle spirit. Stern had gone down by the sea to bathe, and Claire didn't really feel comfortable going back into the house alone because of Mamacita's malevolence. Yeah, she's a scary 4-foot woman. She knew, though, she couldn't stay outside all day and needed a place to lie down. She went into the room off the patio. It's a small, clean room. She pulled back a curtain that hung across the end of it. Dresses in many colors hung there. Likely they were ease dresses, the ones that Father had spoken of. Beautiful. She had been a small woman. She thought the dresses were fine enough to be in the court of Madrid. Though gone, E still had presence in the room. She lived on there. She found Stern on the veranda. She sees guava and aloe and an island in the distance. Quite a view. He greets her properly and remarks how greatly improved her looks are, and the robe suits her more than it did the father. And there's a picture of sangria there. And he says that he's been traveling the island and drinking terrible homemade booze, and this is ambrosia. And she agrees. And Father Fogden is drunkenly passed out on the table in the house. And she asks how long he's known Father Fogden, and it's been a few years. And Stern, having thought of her name, asks if she knows James Fraser of Edinburgh. She says it's her husband's name. Is he a very large fellow? Red hair, she chimes in. Yes, it's that Jamie. Do you remember now where you heard Stern's name before? This is the Stern that Jamie had told young Ian and Claire about, and the spider conversation. Claire thought about how Stern knew Jamie's real name. Is he the Englishman who told Tompkins about Jamie? But he has a gentle German accent. He tells of how he met Jamie. It was in a drinking establishment. After a large spider was encountered on the ceiling when he was having an engagement, a conversation with a young woman, and she burst from the room shrieking. He had captured the specimen, and Jamie came in with pistol drawn. And then Stern had a coughing fit. He thinks Mamacita added too much lemon to the sangria. Claire thinks she would have added cyanide to it if she could. And she asks him to continue the story. Jamie thought Stern had done something to the lady. He showed Jamie the jarred specimen, and the lady from the door identified it before running off again. She asks if he remembers what Jamie was wearing. He says no, not exactly, but he was clad for the street, he thought. Clad was the operative word. It sounds like they're at Madame Jean's, and she was curious if Jamie was naked or not, or disrobed in some fashion. And she was glad he wasn't naked. He was called Mr. Fraser by the lady, then later told Stern to address him familiarly. He shares their discussions. It started with Robert the Bruce, to caves, to spiders. This was the sequitur for him saying there are caves on this island, and Claire asks about them. Hispaniola, unlike some of the other islands, is volcanic in origin, with crystalline schists, fossiliferous sedimentary deposits of antiquity, and limestone. And Claire pours more sangria while she listens. He pulls out a notebook and crumpled paper explaining the topography of the island and the maroons. There are caves all over. Many parts of the island no human had set foot on yet. Only perhaps the long-gone aboriginal inhabitants would have known all the island secrets. And again he describes the Abendawi cave, that it's sinister and sacred. Okay, something was brought up twice. Pay attention for the future. And looking at their view, he points out the small island they can see. It is Tortuga, a coral atoll. It had been a pirate's playground at one point. Then he talks about Port Royal and the indelicate practice of sodomy, because Claire said buccaneers. He explains that buccaneers were sodomites, and it was public knowledge, and the story about Port Royal being swept into the sea as vengeance for the wicked men. And some say the bells from drowned churches could still be heard when a storm was coming for the souls of the damned pirates. That's some heavy guilt right there. And Claire was wondering what Tessa of the Impetuous Pirate would have to say about this. And Mamacita broke into the conversation by saying food. I wonder what cave Father Fogden found her in. Claire is a little lubricated with the sangria. She's feeling comfortable. Jamie knows Stern. Stern is surprised, but explains where Mamacita came from. He found her in Havana. He had been a priest for 10 years, a missionary from the Order of St. Anselm when he had come to Cuba 15 years prior. He devoted himself to working with the poor. He did this until he met Hermenegilda Ruiz, Alcantara y Meros in the marketplace. 6 months later, the wife of Don Armando Alcantara had run off with the priest. And along with them went her mother and the dog Ludo. It was serendipitous the day they ran off together because the English invaded Cuba, or they never would have gotten away from the long reach of her husband. They rode away with all her dresses and got on a boat to Hispaniola. She died there 2 years later. He buried her right there under the bougainvillea. And here they've stayed ever since, Claire says. Oh, yes. E would never leave Mamacita, and Mamacita will never leave E. No one will come from the village because they think it's haunted with her ghost, since she was a sinner buried by a reprobate priest on unhallowed ground. Lawrence says he comes because he is a scientist and doesn't believe in ghosts. Dinner, Mrs. Fraser? In the morning before setting off with Stern, Claire wants to know more about the ship that Father had told them about. A wooden one, he says. Seriously? So she starts to think about how to ask questions of him. The sailors that killed Arabella, of course, he's seen them, and she wants to know what they looked like, what they were wearing. Was it a uniform or something else? All he can remember is that the leader wore a hook, and Claire, not expecting this, drops her cup and it shatters all over the table. And the priest said, "Why did you do that?" And she apologizes, and she asks if the ship has sailed. No, it cannot. It's beached. Father Fogden shows them the way down the hillside. They make their way through the vegetation, with Claire aided by Stern. Because of the father's oddness, Claire quietly asks Stern if he thinks there really is a ship. He says there's something because there's a dead sheep. And at this, he beckons for them and points out the wicked creatures, the butchers, down below. There was a ship and all its detritus. It's the Artemis. Claire is so overtaken, she sees Murphy. She shouts his name, Fergus and Jamie. She breaks free of Stern and runs down the hill. Now, I don't know if she has shoes yet. She has robes on, but she could still be barefoot. Murphy turns toward hearing his name, but couldn't move fast enough, and she plows into him, topples him over, and kisses him in pure joy. I am sure Cantankerous Murphy was not expecting Claire to kiss him, ever. And Fergus helps her off of Murphy and squeezes her hard. And Marcelie smiles at her broadly from behind Fergus. And Fergus says a praise and then kisses her cheeks and lips. Claire asks what happened to the ship. Well, Captain Rains is dead. The storm that hit Claire had hit them. They were blown off course, they were damaged on a reef, and they were so close to shore when the contents shifted, the boat lurched, and a huge wave carried Rains and 4 other men overboard. And Marcelie is clearly upset. They were aground 10 minutes later, if only. And Fergus stops and tells her they couldn't have done a proper burial if it had happened at sea either. They had made empty grave sites for the men right there on shore. Marcelie says she has holy water from Notre Dame that Jamie had given her. She said a prayer and sprinkled it on the graves, and she wonders if the men would have liked it. Claire thinks they would have liked it and comforts Marcelie. And she asks where Jamie is. He is not with you? No, how could he be? Where is he? Fergus shook his head and says, I don't know. Claire finds them but doesn't find him? Where is Jamie? That's how this chapter ends. She's gone through this harrowing experience for weeks without Jamie. And now we find the return and connection of Lawrence Stern. We have the connection back to Lord John Grey. Claire and Marcelie are building a bridge. She met a priest, wink wink. What the heck happened to the Porpoise? What about that cave on Abendawi mentioned twice? This was an intense couple of chapters. We had the mangroves from hell, the storm, Claire's thirst. And that thirst has to have some other meanings. But I need to think more on that. We have a whacked out, defrocked priest, an angry Mamacita, a shipwrecked Artemis, and no Jamie. I would love to get your feedback. You can write it or speak it. To leave a voice message, call 719-425-9444. You can email adramofOutlander@gmail.com. You can always leave it on the post at adramofOutlander.com. And be on the lookout for the Outlander Science Club that goes with this episode. Remember, if you're on Twitter or want to join Twitter, come over to the chat on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and use the hashtag ADOO. And if you want to support the podcast, you can do so by leaving a review on iTunes and the other streaming applications. You can share the podcast. Tell other people about it. Or you can go to patreon.com/adramofOutlander to give a monthly pledge. A one-time pledge is also accepted if you are so led to do so. I hope you have a fantastic week. And no matter where you are in the world, stay warm or stay cool. And as always, thank you for listening. And until next time, Salve.